Hi, I'm Forsberg, and I've been racing and modifying Nissans for decades. And I'm here today to show you just how easy it is to install the new NISMO off-road 1.5-inch lift kit, as well as the NISMO off-road upper control arms onto your Nissan Frontier. Let's get to it. For those of you looking for an affordable solution to get more clearance, improved tire fitment, and a more aggressive look on their Frontier, NISMO Off-Road is proud to announce the new 1.5-inch lift kit. This includes a front strut spacer that provides 1.5 inch of front lift, as well as a 1-inch rear axle lift block, extended leaf spring U-bolts, and hardware to lift and level the rear to match the improved front ride height. This kit is constructed of high-quality fabricated 1/4-inch steel, stamped top plates, and 10.9 grade coated hardware for corrosion protection and long-lasting durability. Apply penetrating oil to the lower control arm bolts, upper control arm ball joint, and lower strut bolts for a few days in a row prior to the lift install. This is especially important if you live somewhere where the road salt is used. If you are not utilizing a lift, park on level ground, firmly set the parking brake, and chock the tires. Break the lug nuts loose while the tires are still on the ground. Do not fully loosen them until the tire is off of the ground. Loosen the 17mm nuts on both passenger and driver side of the truck where the sway bar end meets the sway bar. This nut can be very tricky to get off, as the nut on the back side of the stud has a very narrow wrench flat, so you'll need a pretty skinny wrench to hold onto the stud if it decides to spin on you. An impact wrench can be helpful here. Push the bolt towards the rear of the truck and separate. Roll the sway bar arm forward to give you more clearance during the install. Locate the nut that retains the upper ball joint to the spindle. Remove and discard the cotter pin using needle nose pliers. If not replacing the upper control arm with a NISMO upper control arm, a new cotter pin is required for reassembly. The upper control arm is under tension, so pull down on the control arm to loosen the 22mm nut that retains the upper ball joint to the spindle, but do not remove it. Support the spindle using wires, bungee cords, zip ties, or straps, and prevent it from falling forward and pulling on the brake lines and ABS wires when it is separated from the upper control arm. After the nut has been loosened, tap the front of the spindle at the ball joint cup with a hammer. Swing it from the front of the vehicle towards the rear until the upper ball joint pops free from the spindle. Now remove the 22mm nut. Remember to have the spindle secured with something to keep it upright. Remove the 3 14mm nuts on top of the strut. Remove the 19mm bottom nut using your breaker bar or an impact gun. Attach the spacer using the 14mm stock nuts previously used to attach the top of the strut to the frame. Torque to 22 foot-pounds. No need to over-tighten. Locate and install the supplied 2 bump stop extension plates using the supplied hardware onto the subframe of the vehicle. Set the new strut assembly in place. Note, the assembly must be rotated 180 degrees from stock when reinstalling the strut with a spacer. Put the supplied nuts onto the 3 top bolts and attach to the frame, but don't tighten them down just yet. Align the lower strut mount with the lower control arm and insert the factory lower mounting bolt. This is where using a floor jack or pole jack is beneficial to allow alignment of the lower shock bolt. It may be necessary to use some force or rotation to get the lower strut bushing to fit into the lower control arm mount. Tighten the top strut bolts to 22 foot-pounds. Tighten the lower strut mount bolt and torque to 98 foot-pounds. To reattach the spindle to the ball joint, you will need to raise the lower control arm and/or push down on the upper control arm. Be careful when raising the lower control arm and go slow. The upper control arm bushing may be tight, and this will cause some resistance when pushing down on the upper control arm. This is normal. Once you are sure the ball joint is properly seated into the spindle, you can secure the assembly using the stock ball joint 22mm nut that was removed earlier. Torque the ball joint nut to 58 foot-pounds per the Nissan service manual. Be careful not to over-tighten the nut. If you are installing a NISMO upper control arm, the supplied ball joint 22mm bolt does not require a cotter pin. Reattach the sway bar and torque the sway bar 17mm nuts to 69 foot-pounds. Reinstall the wheels and tires and torque the lug nuts to 98 foot-pounds. Repeat this process on the other side of the truck. Final torque on the upper control arm bolts is 96 foot-pounds and should be done with all 4 tires on the ground. You are now finished with the front end. To install the rear blocks and U-bolts, apply penetrating oil to the U-bolt nuts and the shock bolt nuts a few days in a row prior to the install. This is especially important if you live somewhere where road salt is used. Place a jack under the center of the rear differential housing. Remove only the 19mm bolt on the rear shock to allow the differential to drop. Do not remove the upper shock bolts. Remove the 19mm U-bolt nuts from the leaf spring plate mount. Remove the leaf spring plate mount from underneath the leaf spring. Carefully lower the floor jack of the rear differential to create enough room to place the new lift block between the spring pad and the spring pack, with the locating pin facing down and the smaller taper facing toward the front of the vehicle. The taper block is to correct the driveline angle and should always face the front of the vehicle. Using a jack to raise the differential, tighten the supplied extended length U-bolts, washers, and 19mm nuts until the rear leaf spring pad contacts the rear final drive axle case. Tighten the rear leaf spring plate U-bolt nuts using a crosshatch pattern and set to 54 foot-pounds as directed in the service manual. Ensure all bolts have equal length bolt thread past the nuts. Reinstall the lower 19mm bolt on the rear shock mount. Torque the rear shock bolt to 155 foot-pounds. Reinstall the lug nuts onto both rear wheels and tires. Lower the vehicle onto the ground and torque the lug nuts to the recommended 98 foot-pounds. Follow the Nissan recommended alignment process for both the front and rear of the vehicle. Use the supplied front alignment cam bolts and hardware for alignment and adjustments. Remove pivot bolts and nuts from both lower control arms. Place one cam next to the head of the replacement bolt. Install this assembly through the subframe and the inner pivot of the lower control arm. Place another cam on the bolt, followed by a lock washer and a nut. Place both cams in the neutral position with the large part of the cam facing up. Snug the nut down. Repeat this process for all 4 positions of the lower control arms on both sides of the vehicle. Using alignment equipment manufacturer's recommended procedure, adjust the camber and caster. Torque the nuts on the cam bolts to 150 foot-pounds. Complete the alignment and road test the vehicle. Nissan service manual specifies to retorque all bolts, nuts, and hardware after 1,000 miles to prevent any loss in torque value.